Good evening and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm your host, Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. With me again is my partner in crime, Alex Suarez. How are you doing tonight, Alex?
Good. I forgot to. I remember to put Comrade Gillette's picture up, but I forgot to bring wine tonight because she's bringing wine. We were supposed to both be having wines, but I did bring my cape, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But yeah, we have Comrade Jillette here.
And Comrade Jillette is our guest tonight. Thank you very much for joining us, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you for having me. I'm Comrade Jillette. I live down in Arizona, and I am an anarcho-communist, and I used to run the Arizona Green Party. So that's where most people on Twitter know me.
Arizona Green Party. Now that's cool.
Yes. Arizona Mountain Time or Pacific Standard Time, like where Chris is at?
Arizona.
So right now we're on Pacific.
And if the bill to make the daylight savings thing permanent goes through, they'll stay on Pacific. But we'll see what happens with that.
Well, anyways, a couple episodes prior, I was wearing my golden bolero jacket, and I explained then what I meant by the gold. Clearly, I don't mean it in the capitalistic sense. I don't know if you saw that episode, Comrade Jillette, but the gold that I wore then symbolizes what the gold of this new cape that I got symbolizes as well, which I won't wear throughout the show. I'd end up sweating, but I wanted to start off the show wearing it. And it symbolizes some of my Inca ancestors, what they believe. Because unlike the Spaniards, they didn't see gold as wealth. They saw gold as the sweat of the sun. So it's something that's sacred. And likewise with silver, they saw that as the tears of the moon. So they worshiped the sun god Inti as well as the moon. And so that's why I'm wearing that now.
That's awesome.
It is. It really is.
But anyways, we're not subscribing to the idea of going around with a loaded assault rifle and drinking cocktails. I'm sure it was unloaded. But I am not opposed to having a cocktail and wine once in a while, and I do want leftists armed in this country. And I'm sure we're going to get into that discussion as well. And people are free to comment on YouTube. I don't think it's controversial, really. If you see the amount of attacks on people of color and working class leftists, to me, it's common sense that we ought to arm ourselves. I'm luckily in a state where it's very easy to acquire guns in Florida. What's that?
Armed minorities are harder to oppress.
Exactly. I mean, look at the homeless they're attacking throughout the country. When you have armed groups come in to defend the homeless from the police invasions, the police go away. I say arm the homeless, train them, of course, first to use the guns. But arm them, have defense groups there.
And I'll bring something up because I always like to make jokes about the way we use minority today versus the way the founding fathers used minority when they wrote the founding documents. And that is very simply, if armed minorities were not harder to oppress, the majority of guns in this country would not be owned by a relative handful of extremely wealthy super owners. The most frightened minority in the country is also the best armed, and that's why it's the most powerful.
Well, the NRA and Reagan, when he was governor of California, actually were in favor for the first time of gun reform. That's because the Black Panthers were taking advantage of those laws to be able to arm themselves.
Yes. The California had open carry prior to the Briggs Amendment. The Briggs Amendment was added to another bill completely unrelated and made open carry in California explicitly illegal, so that the police explicitly had a justification for trying to arrest Black Panthers so that they could then claim they were justified in killing them.
I believe the Black Panthers started in 1965, and this was in the 1970s that they started the gun reform as a result, correct, in California?
Reagan was governor in the late 1960s.
Okay. So it was within a few years of their formation.
That idea hasn't gone away because now a pig can shoot an unarmed person and say, well, I thought I saw a gun. It's like, but I have a right to carry that, so you still don't have a justification.
Well, there's an extension of white vigilantism in Florida with the Stand Your Ground law. I don't know if you're familiar with that and how that's
terrorism. terrorism.
Yes, it's a domestic terrorism. It's beyond vigilantism.
I will be personally, and this is probably being as someone who really associates with some of the earlier abolitionists and what they were doing that wasn't legal or nonviolent at the time. Vigilante is something that goes to the heart of traditions like the Boston Vigilance Committee, which was founded in order to prevent black people who had escaped from slavery from being kidnapped by bounty hunters and taken back to slavery.
That was a good thing then.
As Frederick Douglass said at the time, the best way to make the Fugitive Slave Act a dead letter is to make a few dead bounty hunters. That's a quote. This is what Frederick Douglass said. The most prominent abolitionist of the era openly said that people in Boston should shoot people hunting for fugitive slaves.
Well, of course, because slavery was abolished by then already in Boston, and they were trying to kidnap them.
And Boston was, and it's obviously there are a lot of bad things to say about Boston too.
Well, Harvard profited off of slavery back when it was still legal.
Yes, but Boston in the 1850s and 1860s was the center of what really amounted to the vanguard of what passed for anti-capitalism and anti-racism in that day, which was a mostly pro-union, anti-child labor, anti-slavery, sadly pro-temperance, but nobody's perfect, movement that really believed in freeing people. And, whatever else you want to say about the fact that they were a bunch of white men who were still affiliated with religious groups and probably had a bunch of
abolitionists were Quakers, right?
No, they were not. This is actually how religion reverses itself in a few generations. So Massachusetts, of course, was founded by the Puritans, who were ridiculously conservative religious whack jobs.
Salem witch trials, all that.
By the time of 1840s, 1850s, the Puritans who settled Massachusetts had become the far more progressive Congregational church. And even more progressive were the Unitarians, who split off from the Congregationalists while openly embracing a few things that the majority of Christians would have called heretical at the time. Number one being that there was no Holy Trinity, there was only one God. And number two, that all men and women were created equal regardless of the arbitrary barriers between them created by men, which means they didn't recognize rich people as better than anybody else. And they did not recognize the social construct of race.
I'm asking you, are you talking about because I got a text I had to look at. Are you talking right now about the Quakers or the Puritans?
The Unitarians who split
Unitarians they were more progressive than the Puritans. Okay.
They were Puritans once, but they weren't very Puritan anymore.
Right.
They were in touch with a movement that did start among Quakers, Christian anarchism. William Lloyd Garrison was a Christian anarchist.
The Mennonites as well?
The Mennonites were pacifists. I tend to go back to the Munster Anabaptists more than the Mennonites, though I did grow up in the Mennonite church. But the Mennonites are pacifists. Mennonites do not believe in violence. And I will admit that a lot of the things that the church believes about justice are why I became interested in anti-capitalist politics in the first place. And even though I don't know if I even think of myself as specifically an anarchist anymore, because I've just been trying to take in so much different theory and synthesize so much, I really do feel like I'm always going to be a Christian anarchist at heart. And so I really sympathize with a bunch of the abolitionists in Boston.
But let me just clear my 2 cents, and then I want Comrade Jillette to speak as well. As a Trotskyist, one time I gave a speech in 2020, during the rebellion in the summer here in Jacksonville, Florida. Actually, it was in St. Augustine. It was the day after we were tear gassed. We went down to St. Augustine, where they've spoken Spanish since the 1560s, long before there was anything called the United States. And when we went to St. Augustine, I gave a speech because if you try to give a speech in Jacksonville, they would have grabbed you. The police were oppressing everybody. We were tear gassed the day before. So Saturday and Sunday, there was repression. Sunday, we basically fled to St. Augustine, where it was more safe to protest. And I gave a speech. And at the end of the speech, I ran into somebody that I had on Facebook at the time. This is before I was banned from Facebook for my activism. And I said, "Oh, I recognize you. I got you on Facebook." Yeah, we started talking, and then she took a picture with me, and she put in the caption. I think I told you about this once, Chris. She put in the caption with a comrade who's a communist or something like that. And she based that off my Facebook post and my speech that I gave, where I talked about how yesterday was a revolution. It was not just a protest and what we experienced, and we experienced being tear gassed and all that. And at first, it's not that I took offense. I wanted clarification. I usually call myself a socialist or a Trotskyist. So I private messaged her and I said, "What type of communist did you mean?" And she couldn't answer at first. And then I went into her page to see what her political ideology was. And it said she was an anarcho-communist. And then I said, okay, the right type of communist. You're not talking about an authoritarian or a Stalinist type of communist.
Well, so I hate to do it because people shouldn't stand up for Stalin. But at the same time, you almost have to, because sadly, there's so much bullshit that's come in from the CIA during the Cold War, and you have to dispel some of it.
For all I know, I might be wrong, but from all I know, the only disinformation about Stalin that really has disseminated a lot was the famine in Ukraine, that he caused it intentionally, that he caused a genocide in Ukraine. That's false. But the repression, the gulags, the extent that he went after the original Bolsheviks, all of that was real.
It's really important. And now it's going to sound like I'm defending the gulags, and I'm really not. But it's really important to understand who wrote the Gulag Archipelago and what his political motivation was in writing it.
Yeah, some of that was embellished as well.
Well, so Alexander Solzhenitsyn was not a Western-style liberal who wanted Russia to go back to a Kerensky-style liberal democracy that lasted a few months. He was not some kinder, gentler socialist who wanted something that was more Marxist and less Leninist. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a die-hard Russian nationalist who wanted the Tsar back. And his complaint was that he was in the Gulag. Because let's not forget that the gulags were built by the Tsars and taken over by the Bolsheviks.
That's true.
That even Stalin's gulags were much less unpleasant for the people sent there than the Tsar's gulags.
Well, also there was different areas, right? Like the Tsar used to like to send dissidents to Siberia. What Stalin did with Trotsky, for example, was send him to Central Asia, and then eventually send him to Turkey. But there was new gulags built by Stalin, and then there was the old ones in Siberia. Some of them were still used. But anyways, I wanted to have Comrade Jillette get into what her definition or interpretation of what anarcho-communism is, so people can better understand it that are listening in case they're not familiar with it.
So what I like to tell people about communism in general, it's 3 parts. It is stateless, it is moneyless, and it is classless. If it does not have all 3 elements, it is not communism. It can be working towards it, whatever, but that is not communism.
And this is where it's important to point out that Marx understood this and wrote about this. And Marx didn't talk about communism very much because Marx was sort of thinking, well, we have all this work to do first this will take care of itself when people get to that point.
Well, and communism, I believe, is just a natural state of being.
Yes,
like human
I agree.
being, when you just let us do our thing without any kind of government, without any kind of religious figurehead, this is just how we behave. I think it's the most natural human thing in the world. And I think what Marx is trying to do is trying to take that European industrialized society and try to steer it back towards it.
Yes.
Whatever. It's like, I'm not necessarily a Marxist. I understand it. I'm fine with Marxists. And this is kind of where I get into trouble with anarchists, because even though I hate the state, fuck the state, can't stand it, I very much believe that the biggest threat to us as a human society across the globe, the biggest threat to us is capitalism.
Yes.
Because we can tie capitalism to these wars that we're fighting, the environmental destruction, the economic destruction that we're seeing everywhere. It all ties back to capitalism. We have to destroy it. And
I didn't say that the highest form of capitalism is imperialism.
Yes, he did.
Yeah, so, the way I see it, if you are against capitalism, you're already on the right path. Why you think that and what you think should happen after we abolish it isn't necessarily my concern right now. And I feel like a lot of us, especially on Twitter, and some of us are back on Facebook, we fight about these hypothetical situations, and we fight about what happened in history. And I'm like, but we've never seen what we're dealing with now before. So I'm not going to waste time arguing with you when I could be working with you to eliminate the threat that we clearly see right now.
It's interesting because the black, I don't want to call it the Black Plague. Actually, I don't even want to get into the bubonic plague. It's better to call it bubonic. Let's get into something more recent. The Spanish flu, what they called the Spanish flu. That was right after World War I. Actually, during the October Revolution in Russia, the Spanish flu was felt in Russia. It was felt throughout the world. So revolution happened during a flu. I mean, during a massive virus, which was the Spanish flu. And so you had at the height of COVID, a rebellion in the United States in the summer of 2022. Unfortunately, it wasn't successful. But it's interesting. There's parallels. I'm not saying it's exactly like it was then. Oh, there's a comment here. Do you want to read it, Chris?
Yes. Had a discussion with a patriotic communist about the term stateless. They didn't seem to understand that statelessness is a key component of communism. Yes, exactly. Now, this, of course, is because, and I'm going to channel Voltaire again, this joke never gets old, patriotic communists are neither patriotic nor communists.
Well, you know, I debated Caleb Maupin, right? He's one of the ones that came up with that patriotic communism thing.
Well, no, it goes back. It goes back way back.
I debated him once. I'm not talking about a Twitter thing.
No, I'm not even talking about Twitter either. But the patriotic communism goes back to Bill Browder. Not Bill, sorry. Earl Browder. I get my Browders mixed up. Earl Browder was the leader of the Communist Party of the United States of America for a while during the 1930s.
It's like me with the Garzones. Don't get me mixed up with those leftist Spaniards that are all with the last name Garzon.
and he was, where was I? Earl Browder was gung-ho for the Popular Front.
So he wasn't from the United Front.
That was the Popular Front was Stalin's thing.
Yep.
After the Nazis took over in Germany, the Popular Front was Stalin's policy because he believed, okay, we need to get on the same side as the liberals if that's what it takes to stop these Nazis from taking over everywhere. And the only place that it really worked was in Spain, where the Popular Front did win the elections and were overthrown anyway, despite not being communist.
Remember, there was a United Front before there was a Popular Front in Spain. During the initial phases of the Civil War,
the Civil War and the Popular Front, the Civil War. So the Civil War started after the elections. The elections come first. The Popular Front wins.
No, but there was two Popular Fronts.
Okay, so the United Front.
There was no Civil War until after the election.
The
initial phase of the Civil War.
So the Popular Front was the electoral coalition that won the election.
That was the initial one, yes.
Now, there was also a united front during the war, which was composed of Trotskyists and anarchists and communists.
That was the formation of the POUM, which was both a political party and a militia group that was fighting Franco forces.
But the official Stalinists ended up double-crossing them and screwing them up.
They formed a second Popular Front that demoralized the left and ultimately caused their demise. And then, of course, right after the same year, in 1939, Stalin made the pact with Hitler.
It wasn't that they formed a second Popular Front. Is that they said, we're going to put the right government back in charge because they won the elections instead of finishing the revolution, which is what the POUM wanted.
Whatever you want to call it, the Popular Front was imposed a second time after the United Front was sabotaged by the Stalinists.
Well, it's even simpler than that. The Stalinists were in the majority. They were always going to commit to the Popular Front in the end. They waited until the right moment when it was beneficial. And then as soon as they had an excuse, they moved in and focused on the anarchists and Trotskyists.
I don't think they were the beginning. The Communist Party in Spain was much like the Communist Party in France at the time. They were independent of the Soviet Union. What happened was they were reliant on support because the only support they were getting was from Mexico. And a lot of the guns that Mexico was sending weren't working well. And even though POUM was being successful in the fight against all odds against Franco's forces, who was backed by Italy and Germany, and there was some international brigades coming in and helping the left as well, they had the idea that, let's get closer to Stalin, let's get the Soviet support. And Stalin had all these demands in exchange, and they had to send Spanish gold for the weapons. They had to shut down POUM, who were actually fighting the Franco's forces. Yes. George Orwell was a member of POUM. This is before he was known. And so, I used to live in Spain. This is one of my obsessions, the Spanish Civil War. It's a very important part of history to know about. But yeah, I think that when there was an imposition of Stalinism let's not call it Second Popular Front, but an imposition of the Stalinist forces on the left that was fighting Franco. That's what basically,
it was you put the liberals back in charge. They won the election.
Bourgeoisie returned to Barcelona then. Yeah. And if you read Homage to Catalonia, which is one of the greatest books by Orwell, it doesn't get as much attention in 1984, but it's a great nonfiction early book of Orwell, like the book he wrote when he was homeless.
Animal Farm is better than 1984.
Well, let's not get into his fictions. Let's get into his early work. So when he wrote Homage to Catalonia, you see what it was like. The workers had a successful revolution within a revolution in Barcelona during the Civil War. And the bourgeoisie returned to power through the imposition of the Stalinists.
Which is what Animal Farm is about. But that's a whole nother thing.
That came later. 1984 was his last book. I mean, Orwell was literally dying when he wrote 1984. Yes. And he had all these visions of the future while he was dying, and he put it in his book. A lot of what he predicted came true.
It was less a prediction.
But when I brought up Orwell to Caleb in the debate, in the Trotsky versus Stalin debate, Caleb freaked out. How dare you mention Orwell? That he hates Orwell. And I'm like, look, I'm not mentioning Orwell's views, but he called himself a democratic socialist.
Orwell was an anti-communist.
He was anti-Stalinist. He was anti-Stalinist.
He was an anti-communist who named names.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was a dark side to him.
Past that.
I admitted that in the debate, too. There's no dark side to him. I'm not subscribing to everything that he did. But go too far. But
Trotsky never named names.
Right.
Orwell did.
Right.
That's what I'm going to say.
But still, the guy had a tremendous vision of the future and was a great anti-authoritarian. Maybe he sold out later on. So I'm not saying I subscribe to everything that Orwell is about, but I think he had a lot to offer, and it's very revealing, his book about what happened in Spain. The Spanish Cockpick, written by a German leftist, is another great book by somebody who was in POUM fighting the Franco's forces. So Orwell's not the only authority on that. But that's
Orwell's book is pretty good. I'm not gonna bash Orwell's book or his criticism of the Popular Front. I just pointing out that there are some legitimate reasons to have issues with Orwell.
But every person that you're quoting doesn't mean you subscribe to everything that.
I agree.
Chomsky a lot, But Chomsky's turned into a liberal with his old age. He said, if you're in a battleground state like here in Florida, you shouldn't have voted Jill Stein. And I've corresponded with him about that. I voted for Jill Stein twice.
To be fair to Chomsky, he's said that for as long as I can remember, that if you live in a battleground state, you should vote for the Democrat because they're the lesser of two.
I don't think he said that during Ralph Nader. He didn't say that till 2016 that I know.
He's said that. He said that all his life. There's a book that was published by back when they were still big and people still paid attention. There was a book that was published by disinformation.com called Everything You Know Is a Lie. And it talked about, it had a section by Noam Chomsky on elections and how little elections mattered. And this was the 1990s.
Yeah, he also said that the party in the United States is the big business party. And he's trying to change his tune on that. He's saying the slight differences between the two are major differences now, ignoring the fact that the Republican foreign policy is not as disastrous as the Democrat, right? We wouldn't have the situation we have today in Ukraine. Some deal would have been reached with the Russians before they went and invaded. Is so anti-Russian.
So let's not get into so much arguing that we don't let our guests talk. But
I'm sorry,
that's where we're headed.
The foreign policy right now of the Democrats are in some ways worse than some of the Republicans.
Well, let's be honest about this, because there is a tendency, and it comes from people who really denied Russiagate and were right about that. So it always frustrates me when I see these same people cling to these weird ideas that are basically an outgrowth of Russiagate, even though they debunked Russiagate.
Ironic.
And it's this really weird notion that even though they debunked Russiagate, that there are these set of truths about Trump's pro-Russia policy being better for peace. And because Trump was so pro-Russia, he was really the best guy because we needed to be better friends with Putin.
He wasn't entirely pro-Russia either. He sent missiles to Ukraine. But I think that a deal had been Putin invaded had Trump been in power.
So whether Trump did it, what Trump tried to stop missiles from being sent to Ukraine was overruled.
He was overruled. He didn't insist on it. Yeah.
The person who insisted on sending the missiles to Ukraine was Kevin Pompeo. I keep calling him Kevin. Mike Pompeo.
Yeah.
Kevin Pompeo was a boxing trainer back in the day, and I don't know why I keep disgracing him by trying to give Mike Pompeo his first name. But yeah, no, it was Trump's own people, Republicans, conservative Republicans, the people who will be in the cabinet for Ron DeSantis if he beats Joe Biden. Which, oh my gosh, I am sorry, I disagree with David Frum. Ron DeSantis is not better than Trump.
He's more effective, and he can become Trump's vice president and therefore become president. It's a very dangerous scenario. If this primary going on in Florida now, Nikki Fried loses to the former Republican governor, Christ, who says he's a Democrat now, Christ has no chance against DeSantis. Now, if Nikki Fried wins, because she's the one Democrat in DeSantis' cabinet, against his will, she was voted. She's been the thorn of the side. I'm not saying she's a super progressive, but if she wins the primary, there's a chance that she can knock DeSantis out for governor. Then he wouldn't have a chance in 2024. So we'll see what happens in November for that and for this primary by the end of this month.
Nikki Fried and Charlie Crist kind of seem like the same person to me.
They're both in favor of the death penalty because
cosmetic differences aside.
They were like, well, the Sandy Hook killer needs to be executed now. And Nikki said because her friend who was a survivor or her friend's family wanted that, who was the family of one of the victims, actually, I think. But it's like, that's one person. What about what all the family members want? I'm sure there's some family members from Sandy Hook that don't want the murder executed.
How do you feel about this, Comrade Jillette?
Yeah.
How do I feel about the death penalty, or how do I feel about?
That's a good place to start. That's a very good place to start, the death penalty, because everybody's, and I'll be even more specific. How do you feel about the newly discovered love for hardcore right-wing law and order, like 100,000 new cops in the streets, and infatuation with the death penalty, that our so-called liberals have embraced in the wake of, oh no, we've got to get rid of Trump, he's a fascist.
Well, sending money to fascists in Ukraine.
Liberals will always defend fascism because fascism does not threaten capital, and liberals are capitalists. So that's again why I won't organize with them. As far as just law enforcement in general, all cops are bastards. That includes your father, your brother, your uncle, your best friend, your granddaddy, your pappy, whatever. They are all bastards. And for the death penalty, the state does not have the authority to kill anyone. So I don't care what you did. The state doesn't have that authority.
Here's my take on it. Any anti-imperialist nation should be able, in extreme cases, to have the death penalty. But it's impossible to have a death penalty in the United States with how racist and how classist our system is.
Well, and
if you're going to have it, you have to be 100% right 100% of the time, which is impossible. What gives you the right to execute one prisoner over another just because the crimes are worse?
Extreme situations where they've already been found guilty of other crimes and they've kept up the murders. Like, for example, the Batista regime did massive rapes, massive murders.
Now you're getting in the right direction.
Were executed in revolutionary Cuba. I support, if I was alive then, I would support those executions.
I'm not 100% sure. I don't want to be too eliminationist about this, but I am not 100% sure that we will ever be able to integrate cops back into civilized society.
The cops don't do the executions. That's the courts. If you have a revolutionary court or an anti-imperialist court that decide that those war criminals should get that, by jury.
And that's my one potential.
The people making that decision.
That's the people making that decision and not the state.
I'm not against killing people because some people deserve to die. Like, I will always say that. But it's not the state's job because the state has its own priorities. The state's not going to do it fairly, and the state executes innocent people all the time to justify their means.
And the liberal state is going to use that power corruptly anyway. That is why nobody has ever executed a rich person for murder.
Well, they have in China. They've executed bankers.
Now, and that's a very different story. And when you're examining Hong Kong, what you will find is that the leaders of the pro-democracy movement, and I use this in the leaders of the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong are the children and grandchildren of people they are desperately afraid might be shot by the Chinese government for defrauding the people of Hong Kong in various ways.
I'm sure a lot of them went along with the British colonization. A lot of the British are calling to become a colony again of the United Kingdom.
So this is the problem with bourgeois revolutions, be they in the United States in 1776 or somewhere else. The bourgeois revolution will always be against whoever is most threatening the bourgeois' privileges at this moment in time. And the bourgeois state will not be fundamentally different from the state they overthrow. This is why when the country Whigs, who were pretty dang democratic, to be fair, and had some very radical ideas for England in the 17th century, the country Whigs still couldn't get enough support after getting the agreement of all of Parliament to declare James II deposed. They still couldn't get support to declare a second republic. The best they could do was invite William of Holland over to England to become king. So the most radical Republican thinkers of the Glorious Revolution couldn't get enough support within their own organization to actually make another go of an English republic. And so they just invited another king in and didn't really change the government much, except to make it very clear that the king was now owed his position to the law and Parliament rather than the law and Parliament being the property of the king.
Well, there's also bourgeois counter-revolution. There has been bourgeois revolutions. I'm not going to say there hasn't, but there's also been, workers' revolution and then pushback counter-revolution on behalf of the bourgeois.
Portugal.
We saw with the White Guards in Russia.
Portugal, Finland. In Portugal, there was a bourgeois counter-revolution that, in the ranks of the people who had just overthrown the government, bourgeois elements within the ranks of the group that successfully planned the Carnation Revolution ended up with just another liberal government coming back into power, and the anarchists who had organized the workers in the factories had to hand the factories back over to the capitalists.
What century was that?
That's very recently. That was when the dictator of Portugal died in the 70s. He died.
Salazar. He was allied with Franco.
For about 2 to 3 years.
70s.
For about 2 to 3 years, there was another wannabe dictator who took over for Alcazar, and then he was thrown out by the Carnation Revolution, which was planned by communists, anarchists, and liberals working together.
Salazar died in 1970, so that was 5 years prior to Franco. So I'm sure there was a rebellion against him, like in the 60s and all that.
Well, no, the rebellion was against his successor.
Oh, okay. So he died in 1970.
Yeah, and again, it was anarchists, communists, and liberals working together. And what happened is proof that Comrade Jillette is right in not wanting to organize with liberals.
The only time it could have worked, and Trotsky advocated this, of course he didn't call it a popular front, was in parliamentary Germany when the Social Democrats had an opportunity to work with the KDP, or the Communist Party of Germany, in order to outmaneuver the Nazis or the National Socialists that were trying to gain enough power in parliament in order to have a chancellor who ultimately became Hitler. Trotsky was saying that they should have a temporary alliance with them, not because he liked the Social Democrats. They had gone along with crushing Rosa Luxemburg, but because it was a tactical necessity. Stalin and others opposed it, and as a result, the Nazis were able to get those seats.
It was that, so at the time, Ernst Thälmann and the Communist Party of Germany were the two most prestigious institutions outside of the USSR in the entire communist world. They were the single most successful organizing anywhere in the party apparatus in the West. They had the largest party with better electoral results and more members in the Reichstag than any other party in the West. They were considered the model. So when Thälmann articulated the social fascism argument, which I want to be clear was 100% correct. The Social Democrats were absolutely social fascists in the way that Thälmann articulated his argument. Everybody went along with him because he was the guy with the prestige. He had built the most successful party. Everyone trusted him. Up to Stalin. Stalin trusted him, which is why Stalin...
He was one of the few German socialists that fled to the Soviet Union and wasn't executed by Stalin. Because Stalin was paranoid. All the other Germans were Trotskyists and had them executed along with his generals, before the Nazis came into Russia.
Well, Thälmann was killed by the
few Germans that survived after World War II that Stalin didn't touch, and he was able to. I believe he returned to. He returned to Germany.
Thälmann was one of the very first people killed by Hitler.
Really?
Literally one of the very first people.
I know who I was confusing with. There was a right-hand man of Thälmann.
Yes.
I was doing research on him. There was a right-hand man of Thälmann who was very respected as well, who they say was one of the few Germans that was able to return to Germany. He went to East Germany, which was, of course, was a you could say a protectorate of the Soviet Union then, and he was not touched by Stalin. But several other German comrades that went to the Soviet Union were grabbed by Stalin, put in gulags, and many of them died by the end of the war, sadly.
And several were killed outright because they were either suspected of being Trotskyists or because they were too close to Thälmann and were considered needed to be made examples of because of the failure.
Even though Stalin supported the same policy, how could he be mad at him? Because Stalin happened to have the same policy of not working with the Social Democrats. Right?
So this is where the psychology of the bureaucrat comes in, and this is where the real criticism of Stalin comes in. The bureaucrat believes in rules. And infractions of rules have consequences. And when something fails very badly, there has to be an example made that there are consequences for failure. And the bureaucratic mindset is in many ways the ultimate authoritarianism, because you're so submitting to this intangible idea of the law that you're abdicating your entire moral compass to this idea of the law. And when people talk about the rule of law, that's the first thing I think of. Okay, you're abdicating your entire moral compass to what some rich people decide upon in some rich private club they call Congress. What do you think of that?
Comrade Jillette?
So rephrase the question again, because it's like I have a couple different things running through my head.
So the idea of the rule of law, which liberals love to harp on, and conservatives love to talk about law and order when it doesn't get in their way. But the idea of the rule of law is this very arbitrary and subjective thing where people who believe in the rule of law have to step away from their own morality and subordinate themselves to the idea of the law, which is very different from the reality of the law.
Yeah, they kind of make the law its own entity.
Yes, it's a fictional, the law becomes a fictional king that substitutes for the king himself. And this is where you start hearing the founding fathers talking about, well, we'll be ruled by laws, not men.
Well, men
as
make
if
laws, and laws are based on society, and laws are made to be broken.
To a certain degree, yes. I mean, I'm very much of the opinion that you really have to justify the reason for a law against something. I mean, and I can see
in discriminatory fashion the law as well.
Well, I can see the justification for laws against murder and rape and a bunch of other things.
Well, but when murder, it's like, well, what constitutes murder? Just taking someone's life? Because I can justify taking someone's life.
Oh,
self-defense.
And then the people as a whole have to decide on whether that was justified in that case.
How are the gun laws in Arizona, by the way? Are they easy to acquire?
Oh, yeah.
Florida, yeah.
Arizona, if I want a gun, I get a gun. And I can conceal carry it without a permit. I can do whatever the fuck I want.
See, in Florida, you have to have a fisher's license. If you don't want to pay the full concealed weapons license and go through the course, you can have a fishing license. And as long as you have a fishing pole in your car, you can have a concealed weapon just with your fishing license, which is like $18 a year. It's very easy to get. So you can have a weapon in your car, but you can walk around with a concealed weapon without a concealed weapons license as long as you're using your fishing license.
And Oregon is sort of this weird place in between. Because Oregon is a gun state like crazy, but it's also a very, I won't say liberal, it's a very neoconservative state in the way liberal Democrats are neoconservative these days. So
we're in the twilight zone.
They require permits and licenses for things like owning guns and carrying a silencer and a concealed weapon. But if you've got the permit, you can do whatever the fuck you want. Now, of course, obviously that privileges these super owners, as the liberal media likes to call them, and I think this is really an accurate description. The reason that liberals put the emphasis on super owners is because they want to prove that no, this isn't going to hurt ordinary people. This gun control is only going to hurt a bunch of rich people. But the thing that we should be thinking about when we think about super owners is the fact that rich people own most of the guns.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's important to understand that laws like the ones here in Oregon favor those super owners.
And
At the same,
all gun laws are an infringement of a basic human right, which is self-defense.
yes. Problem is no one ever wants to apply that properly, because if the stand your ground law in Florida weren't racist, every black man in Florida would be justified under the stand your ground law if they just shot cops.
Here's the insanity of stand your ground law. If you shoot somebody in the leg and somebody witnessed you shoot that person in the leg and they testified against you in court and said that you were not justified and you were convicted under the highest sentence of wounding a person unjustifiably, you get 20 years. If you murdered somebody and there was no witnesses and you were white, all you have to say are the words, "I felt threatened." And you can get away with potentially cold-blooded murder, understand your ground. That's how insane it is.
Now, on the one hand, in the end, Breonna Taylor's boyfriend was ultimately released because Kentucky has a castle law, which meant that he was entirely within his rights to shoot at cops.
Also because of the public outcry, because usually that wouldn't apply to a black person either, right? Yeah.
But really, that's the whole thing. The cops arrested him anyway.
Right.
And the DA was going to charge him anyway because those laws, in their view, aren't supposed to apply to black men. But someone at some point pointed out, our own laws say we can't do this. You have to let him go, and they let him go.
I had a question about the demographics politically of Arizona. I've never been to the state, and I'm curious of its politics. So I'm sure Comrade Jillette could answer this question. For example, when the primaries for Bernie, and I'm not saying every person that voted for Bernie is a full-fledged leftist. There was different motivations behind it. But when the primaries for Bernie happened in 2016, I think in 2020 it was more or less the same. The Latinx vote in the Nevada primaries showed among those populations overwhelming support for Bernie, who they saw the most progressive candidate. And in Arizona, it wasn't the case. Is it that he didn't win the primary there like he did in Nevada? Is that because there's less Latin people there, or the Latin people there tend to be more centrist?
I would say they're more centrist in some ways, but my problem is I live in Tucson. So Tucson is liberal. Well,
Chomsky lives in Tucson, right? He retired. He's semi-retired, but he's teaching at the University of Arizona in Tucson. My friend went to Tucson a couple years ago to meet him.
Yeah. So it's hard to say how like the Latinos are going to vote because it depends. It's like, are they rural? Are they up in Phoenix? Or are they down in Tucson? It's very, very different.
And class matters a lot when it comes to the Latino vote, and this is not something that people in states that aren't really used to having a Latino population don't get.
Yeah, so if you have money, you vote Republican in Arizona. It's like that's just.
Are there more working class Latin people in Arizona? They're in Tucson.
What was that?
I know Tucson's near Mexico. Where are there more working class Latin people, like in other parts of the country, in Arizona?
They're all over the place. So here in Tucson, we are about an hour from Nogales. So here you'll see a lot of working class Latino people, but you'll also see people who've lived here for generations. They've built up businesses. They have money. So.
Right.
You have to remember that the average, and of course, obviously, the average resident is a mythical person. But the average resident of Arizona, regardless of their specific demographics, tends on average to be better off financially than the average citizen of Nevada. Because it's a retiree demographic, and it's reasonably well-off retirees in many cases as well.
Yeah, and Las Vegas is just one part of Nevada, right? I'm sure there's people with money in Las Vegas, because I heard that
So you have to remember, Las Vegas is another big city. And the rule about big cities is that big cities are the property of a small group of wealthy people, but their culture comes from the poor. And Las Vegas is no exception to that. You have to remember that Las Vegas is a casino town and a hotel town, which means that it's a waiter town and a busboy town and a maid town.
Good point. A
lot of poor people.
Right. That too.
And people think of the rich stuff when it comes to Las Vegas. But it takes a lot of poverty to keep those glitzy casinos going.
And I know down here, another thing that people really get fired up about is immigration.
Yeah.
And think, oh, that's a really heavy Latino population. They're going to be very pro-immigration, and that's not necessarily the case.
It's again based on class and also other things.
Yeah, where it's like, well, I did it the correct way. Everybody else should do it too, and there should be no mercy. So... Are you
originally from Arizona, or are you? Okay, so
Tucson.
Well, I'm originally from Southern California, so then you know this too. But there is a whole. I hesitate to use the word class for one group, but class is actually fairly accurate in this case. There is a whole class of people who have lived on the border since those countries were Mexico, who are a mixture of white Mexicans and more mestizo Mexicans, who identify with the United States and have since California independence or Texas independence or the Mexican War, whose people sided with Americans against their own people, if you want to look at it that way, and who see themselves, regardless of their ethnic background, as white Americans.
And a lot of them, after a couple of generations, lost the Spanish language, right? Like if you go to South Florida, since there's a lot more migration there, you have second, third generation Latin people. I'm a second generation Latin person. I speak Spanish. So they maintain the language. But I heard a lot of Mexican language, not Mexican language, a lot of Mexican-American people or Chicanas have lost the language over a couple of generations, and they consider themselves more American. That could be reflective of their voting and their attitude towards immigration, even though they originated from there.
It depends on
fairly, and it's like honestly, I like to think of people as individuals.
Yes.
Another thing that I get frustrated about is being told, like, oh, because of your race, because of your class, this is obviously how you're going to vote.
Yes.
Like, my dad's black. My dad hates Democrats. He's hated Democrats since the moment I could realize that he was talking about politics. And he gets extremely frustrated when people are like, oh, well, of course you vote Democrats and you must love Obama. And he's like, I hate Obama.
I know a lot of African Americans that vote Green Party, so I don't like that stereotype either.
Yeah, and like we're all individuals. We all have our own goals. We have our own hopes and dreams. So that'll determine how we vote. So it's like I hate being lumped into something because, oh, I speak this language or I look like this, that kind of stuff. So I also just hate voting at this point. I don't like
I think movement building is more important. I used to think that movement building was equally as important as electoralism, but no. With all the electoral contradictions, that movement building is more important. And I would say some countries like Venezuela are in many ways more democratic than us. And I can say that with authority. I was a regional election observer there late last year. And so, who are we as a nation to talk down to other nations in the third world of how they conduct their democracies when we have so many contradictions within our own electoral process?
Our federal government is only 1/4 Democratic. The House of Representatives is based on population is based on representing the people based on population. That is representative democracy. The Senate is based on 2 equal representatives for every state to represent the fictional entity of that sovereign state within the larger federal entity. So that's immediately undemocratic because they no longer represent the people of their state. They represent the fictional entity of the state itself, and the interests of the state are going to be the interests of the ruling class of the state.
Yeah. And at this point, I just don't like representative democracy.
Yeah.
Like, if you want to know how I feel about something, ask me.
Direct workers' democracy is better.
But we don't even have representative democracy, and it's important to understand.
Well, yeah, we're in a
Senate short circuits that
democracy now.
The Senate short circuits that Then you have the Electoral College, which guarantees that the president isn't actually elected by the voters at all, and therefore isn't beholden to them, really.
Other nations have direct vote for the president. Here it's completely Electoral College.
And then you have the Supreme Court, which is appointed for life
Correct.
by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. So the least democratic portion of the government is being decided by the second and third least democratic portions of the government.
That's an irreformable system. It can only be replaced in a revolutionary scenario.
You're starting to see my point.
And I don't even say replaced, I say abolish the damn thing.
Yes. There are better. There's no need. There's no need for the liberal state. We can argue all we want over whether we need state socialism or not. But I think one thing everybody can agree on is the liberal state needs to go.
As long as it's not replaced by a full-blown fascist state, right?
Well, and that's the whole thing. The fascist state is just the liberal state on steroids without any sort of restraint.
Without regulation.
Well, and really, that's the whole thing. When you look at Chris Hedges' description of inverse totalitarianism, which is this fancy, intellectual-sounding, clunky jargon, what he's really talking about is fascism. Because fascism is when a political party outsources certain functions of democracy to violent thugs, and then once they get into power, they outsource certain functions of government to those same violent thugs, rather than operating through either the legitimate political apparatus when seeking office or the legitimate, such as it can ever be, state apparatus when taking power. A whole lot of fascism is letting other people get away with shit rather than really bringing the full authority of the state down instead. It's letting your friends have privileges everybody else doesn't. It's all the little things.
Oh, yeah, it's the application of the law in a discriminatory fashion, as I mentioned earlier.
That's our complaints.
Logistic laws work.
It's all our complaints about liberalism without the puny restraint of liberalism itself.
And, the laws a lot of times are designed to protect the elite, technical things that are in the law. And then also there's just laws, but again, that they're not applied in a fair way, like stand your ground, as we mentioned earlier.
The smartest thing a Stalinist ever told me was that the liberal state is the good cop for the fascist state, and the fascist state is the bad cop for the liberal state, and they are the two cops of capitalism.
I mean, I think Lenin would agree with that assessment as well as Trotsky.
But I mean, this was from a member of the Party of Socialism and Liberation. Which
Lenin said that workers' democracy,
Leninist.
PSL, yeah, a lot of them are Stalinists. But Lenin said that workers' democracy is a million times more democratic than bourgeois democracy. And as you stated earlier, Chris, we're not even in a bourgeois democracy anymore. We're in a full-blown democracy nearing a fascist state.
So, as much as I hate to give Republicans credit for being right, when Republicans like Mike Lee say, somewhat ridiculously and get made fun of, we don't live in a democracy, we live in a republic, they're actually right. And that's because...
Well, I don't even think we're really in a republic anymore, but a republic's supposed to be more representative, and the democracy is supposed to be like direct.
Okay, so I understand what people say about a republic, but we're not talking about that. We're going to talk about what a republic is.
You mean back from the Greeks?
Romans. The Greeks had democracy. This is where, within the limits of its time and place, which is to say they didn't get rid of slavery, and 100% of their population was not actually citizen. I mean, let's not pretend that it was within the limits of what it was. Athenian democracy was pretty dang democratic. Every citizen was expected to hold elected office or to hold office by sortition at least once in their lives. One of the literal reasons for executing Socrates was that when it was his turn to serve in office by sortition, he refused. And when the other soldiers elected him a general during the war, he said, no, I would rather be a common soldier, and refused to serve as a general. So these were actually charges against him at Athenian law, and were part of the reason he was executed.
And he escaped. He had an opportunity to go into exile with his followers on an island, but he accepted Athenian law, accepted his punishment.
The point was that they were very serious about actually making sure every citizen participated in government.
Correct.
Within the limits of who the demos were, the people were actually far smaller a group than they should have been.
Yeah, democracy
was actually ruled by the people.
Right, it's power to the people. Democracia. That's where the word comes from.
Now, and this is where a republic is different. The Roman Republic, by contrast to Greek democracy, was instituted by a group of aristocrats who had thrown out a king to protect the aristocratic privileges for which they had disposed of the king to protect. Like the United States, which is why Rome is a model of the United States. But that aside, a republic is
a type of democracy.
Republic means
of the
our
people.
Thing.
Oh, I thought it meant about the people, like public. No.
So, well, public in Rome is hard to translate directly. People was populi. So when you say public, you're not talking about the people. You're talking about the people when you say populi. When you say publicus, you're talking about the institutions that the people use to administer the state. By which the oligarchs meant themselves.
Right.
Republic, the word republic is res publica, the public thing. It's not a coincidence that when you realize that this translates to our thing in the minds of the people starting the republic, then you start to think res publica, our thing, is really close to La Cosa Nostra, this thing.
Because the translation of our thing is Cosa Nostra, which is the mafia.
Well, La Cosa Nostra, literally from Italian to English, is this thing of ours.
Yeah, Cosa Nostra is our thing. La Cosa Nostra is like, yeah, you can say it like that, that thing of ours.
Right. And that was the quote-unquote official name, allegedly, back in the day, whatever you want to say.
Well, they were afraid of mob rule.
Yes.
The Romans. So they dealt with mob rule by republic instead of democracy.
The Romans had a class war. And the Romans won the ruling class of Rome won their class war by expanding the ruling class to include more members of the less privileged classes. Sound familiar?
Yeah, it sounds familiar. That's how they got like the Irish indentured servants not to unite with the slaves in rebellion. They started paying them a little more.
Yes, and making them overseers. You can never underestimate the feeling of importance and superiority that one human being gets over another when you put the whip in their hand. I believe, like Comrade Jillette, that communism is really humans' natural state, but I believe that capitalism has done a great deal to pervert that natural state, and that we are sick on a social level, and that those social sicknesses are exhibited in the sort of sociopathic crime that we see when people don't really have any other way to express their discontent.
Or have their basic needs met.
Yes. And it's a social sickness. And the social sickness is the system of hierarchies maintained to benefit a capitalist ruling class.
And capitalism was meant to be an advancement of feudalism, a more
So, okay,
system. But in some
Marx,
ways, the feudal society in Europe is worse than what modern U.S. capitalism is, because they actually had more leisure time.
well, and
In
this is
society, there was a study on this.
this is where I kind of think that Marx didn't get everything right. There were some ways that feudalism, from the point of view of the peasant, if it had included penicillin, would have been superior to modern capitalism. And this is really the mistake that too many people make. Marx thought capitalism was a great social advance over feudalism that had extended the life of humanity and made people freer. But no, that was penicillin. And a lot of the things, when people say they would miss capitalism, they really mean that if they went back in time, they would miss penicillin.
And also, it wasn't Marx defending capitalism. It was just Marx saying that capitalism was a little better than feudalism. And in hindsight, he was wrong about that. But he wanted to replace capitalism with socialism towards a communist society.
Yes, he did. But Marx believed a little too much in some of the high-sounding liberal ideals expressed by liberals. And he believed, this is more importantly, it's not bad that Marx believed in those ideals. Some of those are good ideals. The problem is that Marx believed that liberals believed them. And his admiration, for instance, of the United States was based on a false understanding of the country based on his exposure to some of the best examples of people in that country at the time.
He did congratulate Lincoln when he was reelected.
And this is the whole thing. And I'm not going to sell Lincoln's negative short, because you could do a whole episode on what was wrong with Lincoln sometime. But when it comes to U.S. presidents, there aren't very many better. And when it comes to an understanding of the economic forces at work between labor and capital, Republicans understood that stuff better than anyone else in the country. Some of them were quasi-Marxists.
That was when it was a new party.
Lincoln was Marx's pen pal.
Yeah, I know. They wrote each other through Ambassador Adams, Ambassador of the Kingdom, but who was the grandson of John Adams. But
Marx had met William Seward at one point while visiting New York, because William Seward, of course, was a New York senator.
One of my favorite quotes, he said, to the south I have the Confederates, to the north I have the bankers. For my nation I fear more the bankers. The bankers were pressuring Lincoln to continue on with the Civil War at that time. And so Lincoln understood the threat of capital.
Well, one way or another, Lincoln and several other Republicans, again, were quasi-Marxist in their politics. William Seward met Marx and thought very highly of him when Marx came back, because Marx was the European correspondent for the New York Tribune.
Journal.
In his one visit to New York, he met William Seward. He corresponded with Lincoln. So Marx had an exaggeratedly good idea of the U.S. because he was being published in an anti-slavery paper that was very interested in anti-royalist ideas like socialism.
I just looked him up. That's the Secretary of State under Lincoln, so he was a Republican. No, there was other members of cabinet that were Republican, but Seward was one of the Republicans, correct?
Well, Seward was one of the rival presidential candidates for the Republican nomination, and Lincoln made deals with all of his rivals to give them cabinet posts.
Well, I believe Andrew Johnson was a Democrat.
Andrew Johnson came later.
He was the VP. Yeah.
The vice president in Lincoln's first term was Hannibal Hamlin. and we've gotten way off topic.
Okay. I'm just trying to figure out who's who, because you're talking about a gentleman that had a nice interaction with Marx that was connected to Lincoln.
Well,
you're talking about the Secretary of State. Okay.
William Seward is the guy who convinced Andrew Johnson to pay for Alaska, which, I mean, from a Cold War perspective, was the most prescient decision any American ever made. But that aside, he was the only one of Lincoln's rival candidates who didn't turn out to be a scumbag in Lincoln's cabinet, and who ended up respecting Lincoln and being his most loyal guy.
Right.
Then he ended up licking Andrew Johnson's boots in the worst way, because when push came to shove, he wasn't really as anti-racist and anti-capitalist as he wanted to pretend to be.
You're talking about Johnson himself wasn't as anti-racist, capitalist.
Johnson was always racist.
Right.
He was one of those. Johnson hated rich people, but loved being rich. He hated elites, but loved being elite. So, I mean, Johnson was really the sort of politician you see now on these sort of conservative Republican types. He was that kind of Democrat back then. And he was angry at rich people for secession and had been a firebrand during the war. He was a tough guy as military governor of Tennessee. He was chosen as vice president because they thought he was going to be tough. The radical Republicans in Congress were optimistic because Johnson had been so tough during the war and Lincoln had been making these soft sounding noises. And Johnson turned out to be just such a total bootlicker for people who used to own slaves, because he was scared of black people having freedom on a really deep personal level. And it's sad. It's just sad that had to happen. And it's why I can't disagree. It's why I can't agree with JFK's profiles encourage those Republicans should have voted to impeach. They were actually doing what they thought was the politically expedient thing by staying on Johnson's good side.
Isn't that funny, too, that both Vice President Johnson's, Lyndon and Andrew, happened to have the same last name and both became presidents after their presidents were assassinated? I also heard that Kennedy's favorite president was Lincoln. That's also ironic.
There's a book. There's a pair of books. I wish I could remember the author's name right now. The first President Johnson, about Andrew Johnson, and the second President Johnson, about Lyndon Johnson, that really sorts of connects them in all these weird and interesting ways.
Well, they were both dicks, too.
They were both deeply, and they were both deeply vulgar members of the petty bourgeois who had all of the worst petty bourgeois habits that get blamed on the working class. When people use the word vulgar, they don't actually mean the real vulgar working class who are actually common. They mean those petty bourgeois assholes who they see as common because they're not good with them.
Tribe called the Vulgar, right?
No, that's a whole different thing.
Well, I don't know where the word originated from.
Vulgar, I don't remember the exact Latin in that case, but vulgar is just always basically meant the language of the poor, basically.
Well, I know vandalism comes from the Vandals. They were Germanic.
Vandalism comes from the Vandal sack of Rome, which was so much worse than the Visigothic sack of Rome, which was actually really minor. The Visigoths respected the churches and didn't rape anybody, or at least that was what the priest said at the time. They said the Visigoths went out of their way not to rape anyone. It was really like the best we could hope for under the circumstances, which, kind of sounds maybe a little bootlicking after the fact, but, maybe they meant it. It's not like the Visigoths were reading over their shoulder anymore at that point. They might have pissed off the emperor by saying that. Who knows? But yeah, no, it was by all Roman accounts, the Visigothic sack of Rome was like, okay.
It was like amateur hour comparison to the Vandals.
It was not particularly violent. It was not particularly destructive of either church or personal property. There were some fires, but they didn't rape or kill or pillage on large scale.
Visigoths were all over the place. They were in Spain.
The Visigoths were awfully fucking civilized for barbarians. That's the only way to look at it.
But the Vandals were all over the place, not just the Visigoths. The Vandals were in North Africa. The Visigoths were in Spain. They were all over the place. They weren't just in Rome. They were Germanic.
No, the Visigoths ended up in Spain. The Vandals ended up in North Africa. And again, this is a whole other episode by itself, man.
Well, they were enemies of Rome. You had the kingdom of Vandalia in North Africa that worked with Rome. But the sacking of Rome, I believe, was after that.
Well, this is so you have to understand that a lot of what we think of as the barbarian invasions were really internal Roman power politics. See, the king of the Vandals, after sacking Rome, married his daughters to the Roman emperor's kids and married his son to their sister. So he had his own little family of heirs to the Roman throne in North Africa with him, and used this to intervene in internal Roman politics at various times. Attila the Hun was invited to invade the Western Empire by the Emperor Honorius' sister, who promised to marry him and make him emperor. So this was not; these were not. This is not everything that you hear historically. There was always this element of Roman power politics involved, where the barbarians weren't just invading; they were always being invited in by some Roman somehow.
There was a lot of political alliances going on at the same time.
Yes. The guy who finally quote unquote overthrew Rome was only able to do so because he was already the young Roman emperor's number one guy and guardian, and was de facto running the empire anyway. It was easier for him to just just send the emperor home to mommy, because it was a 9-year-old kid. Send the emperor home to mommy and say, okay, I'm king of Italy now. Who needs an emperor?
You had a king and emperor there, yeah. Well, Comrade Jillette, do you like history a lot? Because we like to go off on tangents, but
I noticed I do like history, but some of the history you're talking about, I'm like, yeah, okay.
We need to let her talk
history,
more.
I'm not very.
Yeah.
So, what is the next topic?
Well, do you think that we're a republic or a plutocracy, or that being a republic is part of being a plutocracy? That's kind of like we were talking about.
Yes, that's where we were.
Honestly, what I think the United States is a white supremacist empire.
Yeah.
That's illegitimate and needs to be abolished. I really don't care how it's set up. I want it gone.
Yeah.
I think that it was designed for rich white landowning men who committed genocide and stole land from the indigenous people. It needs to be returned. And we need to get back to a society that actually cares about each other, helps each other, and doesn't violate people around the world trying to take their resources to enrich ourselves. And something that, I don't know, just makes us better people. Things that, like, we can focus on the arts, we can focus on our hobbies, like not making capital for these rich bastards. Like, that's all I care about.
Well, and I tend to agree with that.
But in order to learn how to conduct ourselves in the present, to try to make future changes, it's important to analyze history and have a correct analysis of history. Often history is written by the victors, but there's a history of the oppressed. There's history shown by historians like Michael Parenti, who touched a lot on Rome, historians like Howard Zinn, contemporary of Parenti, and others. Through that analysis of history, because Marx was not just a journalist, he was an historian as well, but Marx was right about everything. We've discussed that. I'm not an orthodox Marxist by any means. But through the analysis of history, I think we can better understand the present conditions of our society.
And the history that I've really been ingrained in recently is the history of Black people in the West, the history of the indigenous people of the Americas, and the history of women in the West. Because those stories aren't told as much. And a lot of the things that you see here in the West now were shaped by what happened then. So it's like, I love history, but I take my history and I'm like, how can we empower these people who history has forgotten and who are marginalized now?
Correct.
No, and that's always a good approach.
What's your take on Julian Assange?
Julian Assange needs to be free. Free Assange. Anyone who shows the truth like that is a hero. I think that a lot of the things that we know about this country that have now been accepted as mainstream, not just conspiracy theorists, come from the work that Julian Assange did.
And free all the other political prisoners while you're at it. We don't need to have any. Free the last few Black Panthers they've still got locked up.
Mumia.
Free Mumia. Free Leonard Peltier. Free everybody who's still being held on any sort of political pretext.
Ambassador Alex Saab, all those comrades. I have a poster here of Assange. I've met members of his family as well. And those that do acts of journalism, exposing U.S. imperialism, like Assange, or those that fight the Venezuelan sanctions that are imposed by the United States, like through the diplomatic efforts of Alex Saab, they end up being an example from the empire. And there's a new term for that, where we're talking about the law. They use the law to persecute rather than prosecute, and that term is lawfare. And even
fight a war by law.
Right, and so that term is English. They still use it in Venezuela or in other countries. They say, this is un lawfare. This is a lawfare that they're doing against Assange, who's admired throughout the Latin American left for exposing the corruption going on down there and the U.S. meddling going down there. And they say it, when there's lawfare going on against Saab, whose wife I met in Venezuela last year. I recently wrote a book that was translated to Spanish about the Saab case. This needs to be more looked at, and I'm not going to even try to butcher his first name because I always confuse him with the other Garzon. But the Spanish lawyer on the left, Garzon, he's part of the legal team now for both Assange and Saab. And this is the lawyer who made the arrest warrant back in the 80s against Pinochet. It's why Pinochet couldn't return to Chile. He was visiting Thatcher. And then this Spanish jurist, on behalf of the Chileans exiles in Spain, made an international arrest warrant, and Pinochet couldn't leave. And so that's when he first got his prestige. He's been involved with this case. There was a Spanish security firm that was in charge of Assange security in the Ecuadorian embassy in London that was infiltrated by the CIA. There was a plot to assassinate Assange that's been revealed. And Assange is still in limbo. It's a form of psychological torture.
And don't you just love the difference between the way the UK treated Pinochet and the way they treat Assange?
Margaret Thatcher gave him a mansion to live in house arrest.
Yeah.
Until he almost died, and then he went to Chile to die. But it's like, they gave a war criminal, a fascist, a mansion. And they put Assange for exposing U.S. imperialism in the dungeon in Belmarsh, which is known as the Guantanamo of England. It's one of the worst prisons. What were the worst maximum security prisons in
Belmarsh was where they put the most dangerous in their minds IRA gunmen and bombers during the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, so I brought that up before too, like when a lot of the Trumpers were saying, not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. Like, you never heard of the IRA?
Well, I'm gonna.
And there's good IRA too. There's IRA now that's in politics that are not involved.
I'm gonna say I'm not always comfortable with using the official definitions of terrorism and applying them the way the people who taught us the official definitions would have us apply them.
I say it's
a terrorist, and I'm like, no, I'm not.
Well,
I'm not saying there was not terrorism in Ireland.
Well, my definition is and it's in textbooks as well. I mean, in dictionaries. But there's different interpretations. But
But who wrote those dictionaries?
It's the targeting of civilian populations for political gain.
Well, but
90%, real quick, 90% of deaths that the United States have inflicted on other nations in war since World War II, 90%, not 19, have been civilians. That's not collateral damage. If the majority of those targeted are civilians, that is an act of terror. It is engaged in terrorism against civilian populations.
How do you define civilians in a situation where you have and this is what the situation was in Northern Ireland in the 70s and 80s, when you have a civil war between neighbors?
No, I know. I'm talking about like when they planted
civilian
in London.
Civilian in that situation, because
Northern Ireland itself, they had militias. They weren't regular army. No, they were militias. They were Catholics.
They had what they call there was what they called counterproductive action,
right,
which was terrorist stuff that actually targeted civilians.
Right.
And when you look at that was actually fairly rare. Even in the worst of the troubles, you did have the really awful bombing of the Remembrance Day parade, which was seen as, don't kill old people like that. But they weren't civilians. I mean, these were veterans who had, it's important to remember, not just served in the World War, but had also served in Northern Ireland in peacetime doing the dirty work. It wasn't an attack on civilians. It was very unpopular and very distasteful and very ugly and very politically counterproductive for the IRA.
Well, you remember the movie In the Name of the Father?
I haven't seen that one.
Well, it's based on a true story. One of the characters, actually, after he was released from prison, married one of the Kennedys. But it's about this innocent group of Irish people that were living in England that were falsely accused of a terrorist bombing that was conducted by the IRA. They caught the guy who did it. They caught the mastermind, and he admitted, he confessed, I'm the one that did it. There's no way these people could have done it. And they still kept him in prison for several years. And one of the guy's fathers ended up dying in prison. I don't want to give it all away, but it's a beautiful, true story about what they went through. But that's what happens a lot of times when there's active terrorism. Innocent people.
But so again,
Irish Catholics rounded up and imprisoned and falsely accused for what IRA had done.
If the definition of terrorism is attacking civilians, then most of the people fighting with the IRA in the Troubles were not terrorists, because they were primarily attacking the other side.
Well, you missed the second part of the definition. Maybe there was an audio issue. I said targeting of civilians for political gain.
But again,
so you mean like the United States law enforcement? Like the moon bombings?
The U.S. in all its wars, 90% of the people that died have been civilian. That's not a collateral damage. That's a targeting.
And this is my objection to using the term terrorist to describe the IRA instead of the United States. It's my objection to using the term terrorist for talking about Yasser Arafat, but not talking about the Israeli state.
Well, under international law, if you're occupied by a people, you have a right to resist by all means. So that could apply to the Palestinians as well.
Yes.
The United States is not a signatory of the ICC and threatened to invade the Netherlands had they ever gone after America for war crimes. What was the last nation to invade the Netherlands? Nazi Germany. So the United States is very dangerous. They're thinking they're above the law. Now they're not respecting the Vienna Convention, which we're signatory of, capturing diplomats abroad and bringing them here like they did with Alex Saab.
And this brings me to another anarchist point, so I can try to get our guest back into it.
Right.
This is where I have the most points of disagreement with my fellow anarchists. I get really frustrated sometimes when I see a lot of people claiming to be anarchists or left communists or libertarian Marxists spending a whole lot of time doing the CIA's work for it. How do you feel about that?
I feel that most people who were born in the United States or grew up in a very Western culture, like just different countries, they don't know what communism is. They see a picture of Stalin and they're
Yeah.
like, see, authoritarianism and communism is red fascism. And it's like, no, communism is a moneyless, stateless, classless society. Technically, there is no such thing as a communist country because that is against the definition of communism.
There would be no borders under that society either.
And Stalin would have told you himself that the Soviet Union was not communist. The Soviet Union was a socialist state attempting to achieve communism. Now,
the only reason why,
that apart all we want, but even Stalin would have told you that.
well, the only reason why there was economic socialism under Stalin is not because he wanted it. He was forced to politically to do that. But they lacked political freedoms. They lacked workers' democracy. They lacked the attempts that Lenin and Trotsky were trying to do because it turned into a total authoritarian regime.
There are a lot of criticisms that can be made of Stalinism, but I'm going to push back on that just a little bit and say Stalin's worker democracy looked a lot more democratic than the United States if you were a black person in South Carolina.
Well, there was discrimination, maybe not as openly as segregation in the United States, but there was discrimination against minorities in Russia, against Jews. There was invasion of Georgia, for example. Even though Stalin was from Georgia, he tried to impose the Russian way on the Georgian people. And I'm not going to say it was imperialism, but certainly it wasn't. Go ahead.
Go ahead,
So
please.
I have learned from looking at what Stalin did, and I am not a Stalinist. I'm not a Marxist-Leninist. I disagree with their way of going about things. But what it taught us is that the people have to be united. The people have to come together because you can make any kind of leader turn against the people for their own gain, for their own power. As long as the people are united in what their goal is, it doesn't really matter what the leaders are doing. It's like the leaders are irrelevant.
Well, you have to have solidarity amongst the comrades as well, not just unity. That's even more important.
Well, and
I don't have to agree with people. I don't have to even like people. But I have to respect them as both individuals, and I have to respect them as their own communities as they form them. And understand that what works for me and what works for the people here in the Southwest isn't going to work for someone who lives in the Pacific Northwest or even on the East Coast. It's like we have to let people organize the way they believe is best. And we have to make sure that everyone is respected and valued for who they are as people. One of the things that the USSR did not get right was gay rights, LGBTQIA, any of that. It wasn't welcomed in the USSR. And that's one of the things that's bad when it comes to a state is there can still be marginalized people.
Here's where I'll give Stalin what for. Lenin and the old Bolsheviks decriminalized cross-dressing, decriminalized sodomy, decriminalized abortion, were socially liberal far beyond any of the Western democracies of the same period. Stalin undid all of that. Khrushchev then reinstated some of it, but it was never again to the same degree that it had been under Lenin and the old Bolsheviks.
Also, during World War II, Stalin worked with the Orthodox Church. He helped bring them back a little bit.
Yes, well, Stalin, and this cannot be overstated, Stalin studied to be a priest. Stalin studied to be a priest of the Russian Orthodox Church.
In Georgia, but yes.
The Russian Orthodox Church was the cultural arm of Tsarist imperialism that went out of its way to Russianize everything it touched. And Stalin was in some ways successfully Russianized by the Russian Orthodox Church, even though he never actually became a priest.
He became
he also never completely gave up the social conservatism of the Russian Orthodox priesthood, which is still terrifyingly right-wing to this day.
Although the Orthodox priests at least can marry, unlike in Catholicism.
Yes, but the Russian Orthodox Church, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is not any better. But there's a lot of when people say there really is a problem with anti-gay prejudice in Russia, it's a religious problem for the most part.
I agree. Listen, guys, it's really late on my end, but it's been a pleasure, and I really appreciate that Comrade Jillette was able to come on.
Well,
Thank you for having me.
What's that?
I said thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Let people know how they can reach you, how they can find you on social media.
Please.
So my Twitter handle is Neighborhood Commie. Let me pull up how that's spelled. So Neighborhood Commie is NBRHDCOMMIE. I also have a blog, which is itsjillette.com, ITSJILLETTE.com. That's also my Instagram handle. It's_Jillette.
And her website should be linked in both the YouTube announcement and the tweet on Twitter to announce the show tonight with the YouTube link.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. I hope everybody has a great night, and we'll tweet at you. Darn it, Alex left.